thank you everyone for joining this pre-digital meeting leading up to us all gathering in Austin, Texas in just a few weeks' time. The purpose of these optional digital pre-meetings are to both to start getting to know each other a bit ahead of Austin and in that way shorten our runway in Austin, but also to give us a bit of a common framing or at least a starting point for discussion in Austin. And we have had a few of these high-level framings. Jonathan Routson has shared a bit around field building and field formation, which will be one of the things that we will be investigating together in Austin. And Daniel Schmachtenberger has volunteered tonight, my time, evening your time, to give a high-level framing of the meta crisis and where we are coming from and where we are at the moment in this strange evolutionary times, and perhaps also hint a little bit of where Daniel thinks we might possibly be going. So Daniel, it's all up to you how you want to frame this and use this hour. I suggest that you would start by giving your framing. If that takes 20 minutes or 30 minutes or perhaps even a bit more. And then we would leave the floor open for comments and starting the discussions. Does that sound fine, Daniel?
Yeah, happy to dive in. It's good to see all the faces here, a bunch of faces of people that I know really well, respect and love, and a couple of people who I've met briefly and a number of people who I've never met. So looking forward to seeing everybody more in Austin. So thank you to Sammy for running tech on this, Samantha Fisher, and Thomas for setting it up. And you all may see Julia Pope is with us. She is a colleague, works with me at Consilience Project, specifically focused on network relationships with projects aiming to do things that are related. So she'll be at Austin, and if any of the stuff that I'm talking about today is interesting and you think you have related projects, find her there. Julia, do you want to say anything before I go on?
Hey, thank you, Daniel. Nice to meet all of you and nice to see so many old friends here. I'll drop my email in the chat if anything comes up that you want to connect about or want to chat more with related to this talk. Feel free to drop me a line either during the call or after.
So I think, I don't know, I'll just share, this feels like a very strange task to try to communicate to this group something in 20 minutes, because some people I have dialogued with and have actually helped me co-develop my thinking on these topics of metacrisis deeply, and other people I don't know, and this might be the first time you're ever hearing it, and also don't know what kind of previous backgrounds and frameworks or even what the nature of what attracted you to emerge is. So, and for those who are already familiar, I've spoken about these topics ad nauseum, lots of places, and hate to repeat myself in that way. And for those who haven't, I don't know what I can actually do in 20 minutes. So with all that preface about the weirdness, I'll try to say something. There's what I gather about the Emerge gathering coming together, when Thomas had originally spoke to me about it, is and what his group with what is emerging has been tracking is around kind of integral and metamodern and game B and many kind of adjacent communities that are working on, rather than just water or environment or energy or social justice or separate issues, some kind of sense of maybe more integrated cognitive, ethical, metaphysical frames that can lead to a more integrated approach to how all those problems relate to each other and what kind of better civilization design writ large could look like. Something like that, right? Some kind of deeper frameworks for deeper and more integrated frameworks, more integrated kind of solution creation. And so the topic of emergence and the topic of like what is emerging and the topic of attractors and complexity are kind of related topics. And one very simple way of trying to frame this thing that we've called the meta crisis involves looking at two twin attractors that I would say are very likely right now, meaning likely future states that I think we can all agree we want to avoid. And then being able to define a third attractor that we are seeking, that we would hope what is emerging can kind of go in that direction. As Jordan Hall's partner, Vanessa Mimas, I don't know if you all know her, she wrote a blog back in the day called Emergence by Design. And that's a topic obviously probably everybody here is thinking about, is the weird paradox of, given that emergent properties are kind of fundamentally unpredicted, and yet when you're trying to design stuff, how do you facilitate emergence in the right direction? And Nora Bateson will talk about, to the degree you become self-conscious of emergence and try to facilitate it, you usually fuck it up. So it's an interesting field of inquiry. So I think I can say some things about what seems to be emerging that I think we can probably all agree we would prefer not to have happen, to then at least have that as kind of guardrails for the field of what we'd be working on. So we, very briefly, if you haven't heard this before, some people talk about the omni crisis or the meta crisis, or some various term for the idea that we're not dealing with climate change as a single catastrophic risk, or risks associated with AI. And obviously, climate change isn't one risk, it's a million risks. When you realize that you could think about climate change causing extreme weather events in one part of the world that leads to massive human migration, that leads to resource wars, that leads to breaks in supply chains or escalation of large scale wars, that there's so many different escalation pathways for the break of the world just from climate change. And the same with AI, whether we're talking about the curation AIs that already run Facebook and social media that increase confirmation bias and polarization and outrage and break sense making, we can see there's already kind of destruction of democratic systems as a function of AIs that are operating that can continue to accelerate. And then the curatorial AIs turn into creation AIs with not just where GPT-3 is at, but where GPT whatever 7 will be soon. And personal data optimized deep fakes that destroy the epistemic commons and sense making nearly perfectly. We can see those kinds of AI scenarios, or the AI autonomous drone weapon type scenarios, or the AGI kind of super intelligent scenarios. So, and those are just two. We've also got lots of issues regarding biotech and the existential risks that could happen from the rapid development of synthetic bio and CRISPR and technologies like that, both through weaponized applications and through just externalities and accidents. And obviously climate change is one of heaps and heaps of environmental issues that come from trying to run linear materials economies coupled to a financial system that requires exponential growth on a finite planet that creates depletion and pollution dynamics. So dead zones in oceans and overfishing and species extinction loss and all those things. So there's the meta crisis is the idea that we don't have one catastrophic risk. We don't have a handful of catastrophic risks. We have lots and lots of catastrophic risks associated with the cumulative effects of industrial tech over a few hundred years hitting planetary boundaries and globalization. And then the much more rapid acceleration of that with digital and particularly exponential technologies. And that both the unintended consequence type of existential risks, just cumulative externalities, or the intended type, the warfare, rivalry, and very specifically, while we can tell the story of how positive it is that exponential tech democratizes power, so there's not centralization in power and everybody can have access to AI and things like that. The idea of decentralized catastrophic capability that doesn't require exotic materials, so the equivalent of nuclear-like destruction for everybody, whether we're talking about through drones or biotech or cyber weapons, that is unmonitorable. This is not a nice vision of of democratizing a particular thing, and it's really tricky when you think about the fact that nukes were really hard to make it was fairly easy to control them because you could see where the uranium was being enriched and where the cyclotrons were. It's not, but it's not true. We have some people doing psychedelic assisted psychotherapy releases over here. So at the house I happen to be staying at in San Francisco. So if you hear emotional release in the other room, I guess that's par for the course. So one of the things about decentralizing nature of exponential tech is that when we're talking about swarming algorithms on drone weapons that are weaponized, or whether we're talking about tabletop CRISPR for biotechnologies, these are not difficult hardware. They're increasingly, over the next few years, really ubiquitously available things that could have catastrophic capability. And that really all you need to know how to make them is information, right? Simply the gene sequences are information. Simply the AI algorithm is just information. So even a world of open information, which we typically like, we like the idea of open source everything, but now if MIT is publishing something about artificial intelligence and a breakthrough that it had, and they developed it for some positive application with ethical review boards and controls, but now anybody can use it for any other purpose without ethical review boards, et cetera, where the information is enough to create catastrophic risk in a decentralized way. What the fuck do we do? Like, how do you have anything like an open society that also has stability? So do you then say, well, one answer would be ubiquitous surveillance, so that if anyone is developing catastrophic tech, we can deal with it ahead of time, because you kind of can't wait till it happens afterwards. And then, of course, ubiquitous surveillance starts to look like maybe that could work to prevent those catastrophes, but probably becomes an unchecked power that becomes a dystopia. And so these are what I would say are the twin attractors right now that we want to avoid: catastrophes on one hand and dystopias as adequate control mechanisms to prevent the catastrophes on the other side. And we are in search of a third attractor that is neither cascading catastrophes nor control mechanisms that are dystopic. And so if you think about, the market is this radically decentralized kind of thing that creates these coordination challenges, right? These collective action challenges, multipolar traps, where the race to first mover advantage, or the race to who will get kind of Metcalfe network dominance, means you don't focus on trying to prevent all the risks. It means you focus on just what the opportunities are, knowing that you'll socialize the risks, privatize the gains, and if you don't, somebody else will anyways. Therefore, you need to race to get there as fast as possible. Same with biotech, same with all the categories of exponential tech. So you can see that the decentralization that happens in markets, you can see that without not having a global government and a kind of singleton in that way, you get arms races on all these literally as weapons between nation states. You can see that the inability to get all to enforce, to both transparently see and enforce international agreements of lots of kinds, means no country is really going to raise the price of carbon adequately, because if any other country doesn't, then they will win geopolitically so much in the near term that fuck it, nobody's going to do it. So whether we're talking about tragedy of the commons, arms races, or kind of these market races, they're advancing catastrophic risk on so many different dimensions that to try to focus on a particular type of AI risk, or to try to focus on a particular type of bio risk or a particular environmental issue, is not going to buy us much time. Even if you took the 3 nearest term issues and totally solved them, you would buy almost no time, because there's so many following them, because they're all the result of some underlying kind of patterns of human behavior that have to do with the intersection of kind of perverse incentives and game theory with increasing tech, both increasing tech because of the cumulative effect of larger populations and globalization, and exponential curves on tech itself. And so rather than say, okay, how do we try to solve this particular risk or this risk, how do we identify what those underlying patterns of collective action problems and coordination failures in human behavior at scale are, and can we actually solve those? So we might ask questions like, are there processes to identify externalities and internalize them procedurally that could actually be implemented? Are there processes to identify perverse incentives and close the perverse incentive gap procedurally? There will not be perfect answers, because the answers will, of course, also be gamed, but can we progressively work on those underlying things? Are there progressively better solutions to multipolar traps and collective action failures? So a lot of our focus is on how do we address the underlying dynamics that both historically have given rise to all of the just like bummers in the world, the things that have sucked and been wicked problems and very hard to address. But as we reach planetary boundaries and we reach verticalization of exponential tech, move from wicked problems to catastrophic or existential risks. And that's addressing the kind of meta crisis of the catastrophe side. But it's important to acknowledge that we can come up with solutions to that are themselves dystopic. And so a lot of people look at some of the actions that, say, the Chinese government has taken to regulate their internet and regulate their, social media, gaming, et cetera, that fixes a lot of the social dilemma problems that we see here and that are really understandable. Like, yeah, maybe it does seem kind of good to limit how much video games kids can play. And maybe the fact that for minors, TikTok is now in China only showing them educational and patriotic content kind of makes sense for a country. But fuck, that's also a lot of centralized power with no ability to check it at all. And any dissent against that will get completely crushed. That sounds like a already more dystopic system than anybody would like, and it could increase in that direction. So the gist is that the catastrophic risks that are the result of market type behavior or individual behavior on their own or non-state actor behavior, to be able to prevent all of them requires some pretty significant ability to monitor and control shit. Pretty significant monitor and control ability makes most of the versions of that look like dystopias. If you still have separate nation states that don't have any kind of international agreement, you still have arms races and those types of collective action failures. If you have a global government singleton, then you have no ability to check that power. So this is kind of roughly the idea of the attractors. What is emerging right now? Well, there's very strong attractors to cascading catastrophes and dystopias, and most of the solutions to one make the other one more likely. And so there's almost a kind of ricochet effect of like, fuck, this looks like a really bad catastrophic possibility. We need more surveillance on this thing. Oh, now we get a solution on this side. Oh, this looks like a kind of dystopia we're not interested in. Let's figure out how to decentralize this capacity. That probably increases certain catastrophic risks. And so to think about, all right, how would we make a system that had the ability to have the kind of coordination, which also means enforcement and deterrence, which also means the transparency and monitoring that could prevent all those catastrophes, as decentralized as they are, that itself has checks and balances on all that power and is not centralized? Can we make decentralized, emergent, fastly and effectively enough coordinating systems that have the power to be able to do that thing, but also have checks and balances on their own power and aren't susceptible to capture and corruption? I would say that is one way of framing up the task of what has to be emerging for us to keep having a chance to be part of the game of emergence long-term at all. Because cascading catastrophes means we don't get to keep having a chance to explore. There's a lot of deep existential questions of what makes a desirable civilization, right? Which gets down to what makes a desirable or meaningful human life, and what even is our epistemic or metaphysical framework to answer that shit. And so what I would say is those are questions I would like us to be able to have more time to explore. But I think we can start with, it probably doesn't look like self-induced existential risk. And then it probably also doesn't look like a kind of dystopic control structure where whatever answers we might have, we have no ability to implement them, because an asymmetry of power and control has gotten to the point of irreversibility. So if we think about how almost inevitable those as attractors currently are in the presence of things like the embedded growth obligation in finance and the nature of planetary boundaries and the curves of exponential tech and the nature of multipolar traps. If you think about all that and you say, okay, to prevent categorically not one particular dystopia, a particular bad AI singleton or China running the world or a US NATO thing running the world, but to prevent dystopic solutions writ large and to prevent escalations to large-scale catastrophes writ large, what would that take? And how could we make such a system, or such a system isn't even the right word, but how could, I'll use it for now because we don't have a better word in English. How could we make such a system that could proliferate in the presence of these competing forces in time without being damaged by its need to compete with those competing forces in such a way that makes it one of them? So that would maybe be a decent frame up of, in the shortest term, like where are we at in terms of the manifold different paths ahead that are part of these two attractive basins that I think we can all agree we would like to avoid, and understanding the underlying dynamics well enough to say we won't avoid them if we don't deal with those dynamics. And what does the creation of a third attractor, other than that, it might have a lot of possibilities within it, what might that entail? So I think I will stop there and see if there are thoughts and questions.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was a lot to take in. And I would just want to say to everybody listening here that I found this fascinating, but also extremely complex. So I'm very happy that we have recorded this. I will have to listen to this again to unpack this. And that this is a sort of a very high level cognitive approach to what we will be doing in Austin. In Austin, we will also try to feel into this space and to try to be in this space and not just analyze this, of course, from a cognitive perspective, but I do think we need a cognitive framing. We will also in Austin very practically look at, okay, so what do we actually do? So we hope to bring together the thinking, the being, and the doing aspects. Before I open the floor to questions, and I see Peter, you are first, and perhaps we could all raise our electronic hands. It becomes a bit easier to facilitate the sharing of the words. I would want to ask you one clarifying question, Daniel, and that is, you made a reference to Nora Bateson and her work around complex systems and emergence. Do you think that we could figure this out? Can we manage this transition? Or will this transition be truly emergent? And by that, par definition, a process that we can neither figure out nor really manage. And if it's the case that this is an emergent process and that we can't manage it, what do you think would be the most critical aspects, how we could anyhow facilitate this process and increase the odds of a third attractor emerging?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, and this would be one that'd be fun to dialogue with Nora about, and Dave Snowden in particular. If people aren't familiar with Snowden's Cynefin model, that's exactly the question he's addressing here, is in complicated systems versus complex or chaotic systems, you have different ways of being able to try to make sense of it and also try to influence it. And the more complete kind of influence that might be possible in a complicated system is obviously not in a complex or chaotic system. That doesn't mean that there are not more effective approaches for how to engage with it. And this is where like safe to fail probes and things like that become important. There's something, I mean, if like I have an old blog called Civilization Emerging, and I think the types of things that I have worked on have probably had the term emerge in them for forever. That said, I'll tell you the shadow side of the word that ends up bugging me is, in the name of the unpredictability of emergence, I have witnessed many times a lack of rigor and responsibility that will happen because we can't figure it all out. It's going to happen by emergence. Therefore, we're not even going to try to design a really effective solution or think through the problem sets really well. And so I really want to encourage not that, right? I want to encourage as earnest and rigorous a job of seeking to understand the nature of the problems and the generators of the problems and the design criteria of solutions and necessary and maybe even towards sufficient design criteria, while recognizing that we should never have 100% certainty and that we will need to do ongoing paying attention and monitoring, and that we're not seeking 100% control or the aliveness of a system is gone. So like I would actually like to increase the level of responsibility and rigor of sense making while increasing the respect for the fundamentally unknowable at the same time.
Thank you. Thank you. Would you, sorry for occupying the floor just with one more question. Would you say that this emergent time in the history of humanity is fundamentally different from previous transitions in the history of humanity? Or is the transition we are at now at about the scale of the previous transitions that humanity has gone through?
The last transition that feels similar in overall delta from the previous phase was the emergence of tool-making humans, pre-sapiens, Homo habilis maybe. I don't think that the emergence of language or agriculture or the computer or the nuclear bomb are as significant. They're obviously all quite significant. And of course, there's a lot of points along that history we could look at of things like, obviously the nuclear bomb was the first time we had truly existential technology where we could in short order make choices that ended the habitability of the planet. And as a result, we had to make an entire world system to prevent us from using that. That was the first time ever in evolutionary time or even historical time, that was just like a moment ago. And I would say that the world system, the post-World War II world system that prevented us from kinetic nuclear war has been the primary cause of the meta crisis that we now face, right? Create a economic system that ensures exponential economic growth of global GDP so every nation can get more without taking each other's shit, which is the basis for war, but that ends up driving all of the environmental crises through exponential extraction and pollution. And let's become so radically interconnected through global supply chains that we don't bomb each other, but that also means that failures anywhere can cascade to failures in a very fragile system globally. And let's create a forced Nash equilibrium with mutually assured destruction, but that only works with a very small number of known actors and a small number of catastrophe weapons. Doesn't work in this situation at all. So I think, like that's an interesting example, but I think the emergence of the type of abstraction that I think occurred probably somewhere around Homo habilis, and then seems to have been maximal in sapiens, and sapiens is all we have left of that category now, relative to the rest of the other animals and life forms, where they would use tools, but they did not evolve their tools. They didn't end up creating something like the equivalent of an Anthropocene, because they weren't doing the kinds of recursive abstraction that understood the principle that made the tool do that thing so they could evolve the tool. That evolution of a type of capacity that made us evolve mimetically, right? Humans now versus 10,000 years ago are genetically the same creature, but we're radically different. And we're radically different not because genetics has changed. So it's not evolution in the biological sense. It is development of new understanding and new coordination protocols and new technologies, which means that evolution in the biological sense is no longer the thing determining what is the primary stuff happening on the surface of the planet. That was a really big shift for humans to develop the capacity to change the world through a process other than genetic evolution. I think there's been a kind of long curve too complicated. I won't try to get into the whole historical curve, but I will say that if we talk about the meta crisis and the kind of mythopoetics of like, we've gotten really good at the kind of abstraction that makes tech, and that does division of labor to be able to do very complicated coordination for complicated things that we can break into parts. And so specifically tech, and that has given us something like the power of gods, meaning we can genetically engineer new life, we can extinct species, we can destroy ecosystems, we can make new environments. This is not the power of an apex predator, right? A polar bear can't do any of that. It's the power of, mythopoetically, the power of a god, or the power of nature itself is the only kind of comparable thing in terms of what can change that much, that we have something like the power of gods, but do we have the kind of wisdom and prudence to be able to steward that well? And that without something like that, then we don't make it through the Fermi gate and self-terminate. And so I think the type of mind that does abstraction, breaks wholes into parts, and is able to optimize parts while externalizing harm to other parts of the whole, we have been better at that type of mind than the type of mind that understands wholes well enough to prevent externalities and unnecessary rivalry and to be stewards of the whole. But I would say we can't have as much effect on the whole as we have and not be stewards of it all, internalizing everything and continue. And so that is, again, like a fundamental shift in the nature of the dynamics that are kind of determining what is happening in the world. That is, again, not just genetic evolution, but is also not the kind of tool-making mind. It's something else again. So yeah, I would say whether we make it through Fermi's gate or not, and what it would take to make it through, meaning to be safe stewards of that type of power, which means being able to internalize all the externalities of it to make that power part of an actual sustainable ecosystem, right? A biological and technological and sociological self-organizing ecosystem. That shift would be the next shift in almost like evolutionary process itself, something like that.
That's big. I think many of us are starting to realize more and more, of course, that we are facing a deep systemic shift. Some are comparing this shift with the process humanity went through during the Enlightenment, when we went from a dogmatic religious way of looking at the world into a completely new scientific rationalistic worldview, or even comparing the shift to the shift during the axial age, when we went from hunter-gathering societies and starting to make civilization and created the great religions. But what you are saying is that this could possibly be the start of something that is even bigger and more fundamental than that.
Determined by the same game theory of the thing that one was selected for. The thing that one in a near-term narrow sense was selected for. So of course the plow won over the digging stick in terms of agriculture, because you can get a lot more caloric surplus as a result. And so the thing to understand was, once the plow was developed, it was not optional. If another tribe used it and they could grow their population and make it through famines, and your tribe didn't, your tribe's probably going to die in tribal warfare to them, or at minimum get colonized by them or something like that. So it becomes obligate to use the thing that confers more power, or you lose in power games. And so we see Tibet's losing to China's many, many times when it matters throughout history. And so tech that confers power ends up being obligate. And then it confers power by humans using it in particular ways, which means it changes the patterns of human behavior. So a human beating a cow all day long to pull a ox is very different than a human hunting all day, right? It's a totally different life. So now that's conditioning, different perception of the world, different mythos, different rationalization. So tech changes psyches and cultures. And insofar as it confers power, it becomes obligate. So in the same way that it was obvious that the plow was going to win, and so then you got agrarian mythos rather than hunter-gatherer mythos, and animism fell away, and everything changed in that way. Of course, calculus was going to beat dowsing at firing cannonballs, right? And of course, the steam engine was going to beat horses at being able to pull stuff. And so each of those shifts were simply whoever used the insight that conferred game theoretic advantage in the near term, one, which created a race to use and advance that stuff faster. And that's all part of one curve. But that curve self-terminates because each of those things also externalized harm. They caused environmental harms, they caused enmity with others, it drove arms races. And that as you get into verticalizing arms races, and as you hit planetary boundaries while still trying to do exponential externality, that whole thing ends. So the thing that has always determined the success of civilization, which is the more game theoretically effective thing, is itself self-terminating. And so each of those previous steps were do the thing that actually just wins for some in-group on short time scales. And then the dynamics that emerge from everybody doing that. And what I'm saying now is we have to do something that is fundamentally different than that. because that process itself self-terminates, because that's basically an evolutionary driver, right? It's just kind of the normal rivalrous evolutionary driver, but with the ability to advance the rivalrous capacity radically through mimetics, through technology, as opposed to just through genetics slowly. And so that rivalrous evolutionary driver multiplied by tech self-terminates. And so at a certain point, we have to be able to forecast and see that and figure out how to make coordination protocols that we bind ourselves to that don't do that thing anymore, that are not based on primarily that is some kind of natural science or philosophy with an ought that is game theory, but an ought that is different than that. Yeah, that's why I would say it is much more fundamental than modernity or the agricultural revolution.
Thank you. So the question really becomes, can we collectively bring up the wisdom and the agency that is necessary to form really a worldview and a culture that takes us outside of these game dynamics that we have been captured by during the evolution of civilization?
Worldview and culture is 1/3.
And the other?
Worldview and culture would be what we would call superstructure, if we were going to use, say, Marvin Harris's terms from cultural anthropology. So there, the triplicate of looking at a civilization is infrastructure, social structure, and superstructure. The infrastructure is the physical technologies, the whole suite of technologies that a particular society uses to mediate its physical needs. The social structure is the collective agreement field, which is basically governance and law, and the institutions that mediate that. And the superstructure is the culture and the values and the kind of what is the definition of the good life and ordinating basis that should be the jurisprudence of the law. Those different social philosophers emphasize which one is most fundamental. Marvin Harris argues that infrastructure drives all the other ones, with examples like I just gave about how the plow as a technology ended animism, because you can't be animistic beating an ox all day. And it, if you kind of get into the analysis, it changed psyches and cultures in the most profound ways regarding views towards men and women and animals and the environment and like so many things. So tech is not values neutral. It's the idea that tech is values neutral and it can do good or bad things just based on how we use it is just complete gibberish. Tech codes for patterns of human behavior, different patterns of human behavior code for different human minds. Tech that confers power becomes obligate. So tech is not just benefiting some specific thing and maybe causing externalities through physical causation. It's also causing externalities through psychosocial causation, through the nature of how it affects minds and cultures. So we have to build our technology, not just have a more enlightened culture that binds the technology, but also where we build the value systems into the design of the technology by asking, if humans use this in the way that confers advantage, what behaviors will they be doing? And how do those behaviors affect the nature of mind? And how do lots of people doing that affect the nature of culture? And factor that kind of axiological consideration into the design of tech itself. And, of course, then we also have to have the nature of how regulation works and how incentive works, because if we don't deal with perverse incentive and if we don't deal with effective deterrence, then you still don't make it. So that's the social system part. So we could go into this at depth, and I think it'd be very interesting, but there are social philosophers who basically say it's fundamentally all the social system, like get the monetary system right where it doesn't have perverse incentive and externality, and everything else will get fixed. But if ultimately people are incentivized in a decentralized way to maximize extraction and externalization, that's just going to happen. Other people say, no, it's really about the superstructure, about the culture, because otherwise, like what people care about and think is important will determine the direction of their research and innovation, and also what type of laws they try to make to bind the tech. And other people say, fuck, the tech is the thing that really confers the power, that's real power in Lacan sense. And so basically the Industrial Revolution was just going to win, and both liberal democracy in the US and communism in the USSR were both riding industrialization, trying to drive different social structures and superstructures. So, some people are like, fuck, just get the tech right. Whoever wins AI supremacy wins everything. That's the thing. They're all partially right. I would say infrastructure, social structure, and superstructure are interaffecting. They are equally fundamental, and there are fundamental problems in each of them that lead to certain kind of vicious cycle dynamics that create things like multipolar traps. And so to make a global civilization work from now requires a certain amount of interventions in all three of those that lead to virtuous cycles towards particular sufficient criteria.
Thank you. Thank you. So then I give the word to Peter Wang.
Okay, hi. Hey Daniel, good to see you. I have a question here, which is, it seems to me like in your framing of this, avoiding the multipolar trap and emerging a third attractor and things like that, there seems to me that there's this paradigm that we have to do something to prevent the world from sliding into one of these two bad attractors, right? Dystopian over control or blowing up, ecological disaster, things like that. And I guess I have a question kind of preceding that. Would you say that's accurate? Sort of, is that an accurate characterization? Or on a scale 0 to 100? Like we have to act now. We have to do something. We have to create a system that's a third attractor, that's a better thing than these that now competes. The current systems that will push us into one of these two bad attractors.
There's some tricky things in there in terms of the we have to such and such, as opposed to what is already.
We should. The mission for people who are on this call, getting together, interested in this, is to try to create this sort of thing, or create the conditions so it emerges, or whatever we want to, however many words we want to throw in there. At the end of the day, we all want to make it better. We want to make a better thing here. That's not one of these two shitty things. At the end of the day, yes?
That's fair. Please.
Okay.
The framing. Yeah.
Okay, great. So my question is, have we done it? Has there been an investigation done into sense making around this question of what if we're already past that point? So the primary task at hand, rather than trying to create a third thing that outcompetes these two things and can succeed in some big way, that we think of, oh, good, we avoided these two big bad things. Rather, the task at hand is one of triage, figuring out of the 4 billion, 5 billion people that come out of the other end of this ecological period of disaster. Maybe it's only 2 billion. How do we make sure that the world is best for those people to continue and to survive in some ideal, or not ideal, but the best possible modality? Does that make sense? Like, my question is it that we're trying to figure out how to keep the bus going off the cliff, or is it the bus is already off the cliff? We're just trying to figure out how to keep as many people alive when it impacts the bottom as possible. So that very binary question, that's my thing, is who's thinking about this, or where do you stand on this, or what is thinking around this?
We have to define different scales of what we mean by catastrophic risk. Typically, existential, we mean something more significant like the end of all sapiens, or maybe even the end of all hydrocarbon life or all mammals or something like that.
Sure.
And we certainly see scenarios that could do that, that could
absolutely, yep,
are not habitable. I expand it to talk about catastrophic risk, but like obviously on some definition, catastrophes are happening all the time. And so we're like, for all the species that are going extinct every day, we already missed the boat, right? We don't really get to bring them back. And for all of the civilians that die in war, and we call them collateral damage or whatever, like we already missed the boat there.
Yeah, right.
So I think it's fair to say, and those types of problems have happened for a long time. And of course we can read the like Pinker Diamandis narratives of why things are getting better, and those are partially true and cherry picked. And it's also pretty easy to see all the things that are getting both fundamentally worse and orienting towards catastrophic possibility that wasn't there before at scale. So I think and especially like some people have focused on this for a long time, but since COVID, since the degree of polarization in the US between kind of Trump and anti-Trump and woke and anti-woke, and protests and riots and January 6th and whatever, and then like Australia catching on fire and then flooding as most of the continent, Ukraine, I think it's a much more widespread sense that the global order and the Pax Americana world is no longer stable, and that there is accelerating breakdown. So I think it's more fair to say we're already in the breakdown mode, right? Like that's already happening.
Oh yeah, and right.
So then the question is not how do we prevent catastrophe? It's how do we prevent as much catastrophe as we can, and particularly how do we prevent the levels of catastrophe that make the future possibility set radically curtailed. And so I would describe certain kinds of catastrophic risk, meaning, okay, maybe there are some people left in holes who come out into a shitty poison biosphere and we've lost most of our knowledge. Like, okay, that's not a full-blown existential risk, but I would do everything I can to avoid that scenario. Now, do I think that we can avoid the next few years of extreme weather events, and particularly heat waves due to climate change causing massive climate change refugees? Nope, I don't think we can avoid that. I don't think. And now, do I think we can do things that make it to where that doesn't turn into kinetic World War III? Yes, I think if we act very, very effectively and intelligently, we can do stuff to mitigate how bad that is. Do I think it's entirely possible that that becomes World War III? Yeah, I do think we could have a heat wave in the next few summers that displaces 100 million people in northern India, for instance, that creates resource wars that cleave along Muslim Hindu lines. It becomes an India-Pakistan conflict and escalates from there. I think that's entirely possible as early as this summer or next summer. Of course, because it's a complex system, it might not happen for 4 or 5 years. There's very little chance that on the current trajectory, things like that don't start happening in a single-digit number of years. Almost no chance those things don't start happening. Can we prevent them, like turn the climate around in time? Nope. Can we create mitigations to where that migration doesn't have to turn into as much death as it would currently and as much escalation? Yeah, we totally could, and we totally should, and it is not being adequately tended to. So the question of like how much can we do to triage, and you use the word triage, and so do I. When I think about what needs done right now, I think of 3 horizons of focus that have to be happening simultaneously. I think of it as triage, transition, and kind of post-transition or long-term. Triage is what are the nearest term risks that we just have to prevent through whatever the fuck means we prevent them, without causing some other worse externality, but not through necessarily underlying systemic shifts, because we have to buy time. And so that could be things like dealing with climate refugee type scenarios, creating, food, water, etc. And that's also things like the legislative and public attention and other action needed to slow down and regulate certain activities in certain categories of exponential tech like AI and bio. I think those are just like triage must fucking happen. Simultaneously, there's how do we work with the existing institutions? So capitalism, nation states, IGOs, etc., that are still running the world and aren't going to all break down really quickly, and the world's not going to transition to a new thing quickly. How do we transition them in ways that are intelligible to them, at least in the right direction, so that the many kind of catastrophes that they play some role in can be oriented a bit better? And then the long term of how do we develop fundamentally new civilization stacks, comprehensive new infrastructure, social structure, superstructure stacks that have the right criteria is kind of like the post-transition. I think that those are 3 distinct types of activities that all must inter-inform each other, because there's activity coming out of each of those that is both necessary and affects the nature of how the other ones are done. And so, yeah, I think thinking about that, it's not about preventing a thing, but it is already about steering and triaging a thing, and hopefully preventing certain levels of it is a clearer way to think about it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Now we could get to the how do we know we're not already too late for full-blown existential risk, and that AGI apocalypse is already inevitable, or that what it would take to be able to prevent a full breakdown of global supply chains based on the intersection of the lack of energy return on energy investment, diminishing returns on hydrocarbons, and the growth system of global GDP is something that's unpreventable. Or there's some real questions about have we already passed those points? And my take is no, we are not completely past the point of irreversibility on the truly existential things, but we're not far either.
I think it'd be really helpful to ground on a scale, let's say an 8 billion gradation scale of, which over what time horizon, how many 100 million or how many billions of lives we're talking about being essentially, I don't know what the correct term is, but you know, extinguished below a certain level of what we would find to be acceptable living, right? Because the fertilizer farming is like 40% or almost maybe 50% of the carrying capacity of the earth, right? So right there, that's 4 billion people. If you lose all of that, if you really want to get rid of all of that, right? So I think on just because it's easy when we talk about these things from a very high level, you only see like the Marianas Trench or Everest, and you don't see anything in between. I think it's really helpful to be talking about on a 1, 3, 5, 10-year horizon, how many 100 million, how many billion of people are affected by certain kinds of models and the expectation value likelihood, right, of certain things there.
And the same thing is like why it's still hard to predict weather 10 days out because of the nature of the complex system and why the kind of IPCC models vary so extremely. This is also the key here because can you predict an extreme weather event very well? Not that well. And then based on it, the scenarios by which it's modulated that make the least bad scenario versus the worst scenario, the parameters of what changes it are both small and hard to control. So you could have a scenario where it's like, you know, 10 million people die, or no, it's actually nuclear World War III, based on relatively tiny and hard to predict parameters. And so the ranges and the confidence margins here are kind of tricky, but yes, that process of being able to say, let's at least sketch out the map. What does the catastrophic horizon and escalation pathway map look like? And then let's try to look at our own assessment and say, you know, what might be missing? What are possibly the wrong assumptions? And how do we watch what's happening and update our map in real time? That's totally a useful thing. I don't know if that's a thing that we will make a breakout group to do in Austin, but could do.
Absolutely.
It's more of one in terms of cohering a movement.
Sorry.
So anyway, I'll yield the floor. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm conscious about time, and we have set aside 1 hour. I don't know, Daniel, there's so much energy in the room, and we have a few hands. Would you have another 15 minutes beyond the hour? Yeah. So let's go for 15 minutes beyond the hour, but have a firm stop there. So I give the word to Joe. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah. Hi, Daniel. Hi, everyone. It's lovely to be here. I thought maybe I'd weave Anastasia in first because we've had a lot of guys in a row, and maybe you can come back to me after her if Anastasia feels good about that.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Joe. Anastasia, are you there?
Start video. Hello. I'm so sorry. I'm literally giving a manicure to my boyfriend here and just listening to the delightful discussion. Ooh, thanks for giving me the floor. Daniel, I really do appreciate how you break down a lot of the really rather complex interwoven systems into their component parts, but I don't hear as much solutioning on your end. And I know that that's probably perhaps just not your focus area, but I do want to start connecting some of the diagnosis to implementation, particularly when it comes to kind of institutions and the inertia that they deal with. Like, how do we start moving things like monetary systems and governance and Congress towards ways to make different choices that I guess define self-interest in a broader way than just kind of localized to what's helpful to me and my immediate surroundings, but more like ecosystem level solutions. So just any thoughts on implementation and institutional inertia?
I'll maybe speak to just problem assessment versus solutions. I obviously don't have anything like comprehensive or adequate solutions to everything for every institution, so couldn't begin to try to do that. But even where there are solutions that I think are viable, both in terms of architectures for long-term solutions and enactment pathways to get there, it's my MO in situations like this to work on making sure the nature of the problems is better understood first, because if I try to describe a particular solution, it will certainly be wrong a few minutes into getting into it, because there will be counter forces that try to address it and change it. So like, if I'm not going to be there ongoingly, whoever is there working on it, the degree to which they understand the dynamics well is their ability to innovate in real time better solutions, because they understand what solution means. I think so. it's one of the reasons I also rather lead with questions that people would think about more than specific answers, because the specific answers will always be changing based on changing context. So if you were to look at a system and say, where are the perverse incentives? How do we identify those? How do we deal with them? Where are the nature of the externalities, and how do we deal with that? Where are the kind of multipolar traps? Where are the, what are the ways that technology is influencing culture, or that culture is influencing, you know, when you use those frameworks and think about it, I think a lot of things come clear. Also, when you think about the theory of trade-offs of like, is this solution to a catastrophe making another catastrophe worse? Like a particular way of planting CO2 sequestering crop using more nitrogen fertilizer that makes dead zones happen faster or something? Or is the solution to catastrophes as a whole making dystopias worse? I want more people who think about the problem space in a better way, who then can be thinking about bespoke solutions. Because if I'm in a particular institution, the right answer is going to involve the specific psychologies of the people involved, the specific flows of money, the specific actuator vectors that are actually available. And so very much like if you've ever read Jeet Kune Do by Bruce Lee and his kind of philosophy of martial arts that some might say was kind of underlying the beginning of mixed martial arts, it was the concept was the formless form. Don't give a fucking solution of here's how you deal with a punch, here's how you deal with a thing. Give the capacity to respond with more fluidity and intelligence and appropriateness quickly in the moment. And so there's something that is more Jeet Kune Do that I'm looking for than form, of people who are understanding the generative dynamics of the problems well enough to be able to assess them bespoke and changingly in contexts and be able to work with those contexts better. Now, of course, talking about general frameworks for solutions is also useful. But if we don't frame the problems up first, they'll seem like gibberish, because you'll say, why don't we just X, Y, and Z? Because the problem assessment is off. And so we could definitely talk about certain things of like ways of using contract law to be able to bind particular perverse incentives that is implementable in many contexts, and ways of being able to procedurally like run processes that identify externalities. And like there's a bunch of categories of solutions that once we understand the problem set, we could say are often useful, but the specific which ones you'd use and the specific applications will always be both bespoke and ever changing.
Thank you. And thank you, Anastasia.
Thank you.
So back to Joe.
Yeah, great. At the risk of oversimplifying, Daniel, I want a shot at trying to condense your beautiful thesis into a single sentence. And it feels to me perhaps that we've reached a point where we really need to emphasize our cooperative nature rather than our competitive nature, that the technology and systems have gotten to a point where we don't really have a choice anymore. And that leads me to think that maybe in this network, what draws me to emerge to your thinking, to all these beautiful people here, is that perhaps we could model that we could be an example of really, really high level cooperation, because the level of presence and ability on all the different levels of the people in this call is extraordinary. We've reached a point with online communication technology where I think we can have meaningful global cooperation. And that could be one example of many of how that really leads to new higher order outcomes that could be modeled at a higher level. So I wonder how that sits with your reflections on that.
Kind of, but not really. It is a simplification to the point that I believe it ensures failure of any approach that works without direction. Very easy to try to make Tibet again. Very easy to try to make some lovely nature-loving indigenous type society that just gets destroyed by the Genghis Khan or Alexander the Great, because we're focused on coordination and cooperation, not competition. And so we get destroyed by the competitive external forces. Like that is the frame underneath, I would call like the naive green hippie approach. And there's a partial truth to it. But unless you get to wave a wand and magically get everyone in the world on the same page, then whatever group you're working to create increased cooperation within is still in relationship to the outside world, where they might hold a competitive relationship, whether you want to or not. And to the degree you start gaining some meaningful territory that they want, that they hold as competitive, they will just destroy you if you don't know how to at minimum protect yourself. And then let's say you can just protect yourself, and you could make some sweet little Nordic-like country that had a wonderful Gini coefficient and environmental sustainability and good education and healthcare for everyone. but it can't actually influence the rest of the world, then China and the US still start a nuclear war and kill everything or destroy the environment. So you have to not only be able to not be destroyed by those external forces, you have to be able to influence them, which means in some way overpower or change them. And they are good at power. So given that your group that is working on coordination will not exist in a bubble. Now, also, even the people inside the group, after 1,000 ayahuasca journeys and polyamory and getting in touch with their whatever, are still going to have competitive impulses. And if you pretend not, it'll just come out as a shadow in weird, fucked up ways. And so you don't get rid of that. You have to be able to understand how to channel and bind it, right? But bind it where it still has a purpose. So competition, the etymology is something like to strive together, the healthy version being, I become better at wrestling. When I'm wrestling with someone who's good and better than me, if I'm wrestling someone who I beat every time, I don't become better. If I want to develop my own capacity fully, there's a place we're getting to, and I become better at thinking when I talk to someone smarter than me and they tell me what's wrong with my thinking. And so my own impulse, not just of being, but becoming, wants a kind of challenge where I don't want them to be worse, right? In the healthy example of competition, I don't just always want to beat them. I actually want them to keep getting better, because otherwise there's nothing that gets to help grow and challenge me in that way. So there is a healthy and critical and unavoidable principle of competition that whenever we try to avoid it, which was the naive hippie culture I grew up with personally, it comes out as weird shadows. It doesn't recognize it in other places and fails to it continuously. It gets manipulated and whatever. So there has to be it's not about cooperation over competition. It is a deeper understanding of both the relationships between them and what both a viable system would look like if the whole world did it, but also what does it take to make a viable system in the presence of the rest of the world being rivalrous and competitive that doesn't get crushed by that and can change things in time. So yeah, that degree of, so increasing functional kinds of cooperation and coordination and decreasing pathological kinds of competition, absolutely. But if you simplify it too far, then it's actually off the mark.
And perhaps the dynamics between these different forces is a little bit different in the different horizons that you were talking about, Daniel.
Absolutely. Given, if we talk about a kind of post-transition world where you don't still have external rivals seeking maximum military wins or whatever it is a different scenario. So there is the difference between what a long-term strategy would be and what enactment in the current world looks like. And it's very important.
Yeah, thank you. So David, please.
All right. Thank you, Daniel, for that amazingly succinct and terrifying overview of your interpretation of the world system. I was thinking while you were speaking, two things. One is that it would be great to have you write one of those Oxford Press very short introductions to civilizational collapse. Maybe you're already doing that. Maybe you're already in something like that. But the second thing was how useful that would be for my students. So I teach philosophy to college students. And a lot of what I've been thinking about over the last couple of years, and especially I'm interested in learning about through the Emerge conferences, is how to infuse this kind of, this way of thinking. I love your Bruce Lee metaphor there, for young people. So thinking in the long term, and I'm thinking about this recently from hearing about Tomas's profile of the Nordic secret and how crucial this kind of long-term, very deliberately developmental educational system had such an outsized cultural impact at scale in a couple of countries. So what do you think is just some useful ways to help infuse this kind of thinking, which I think is very provocative? You're saying maybe a leap tantamount to the discovery of fire in our species is sort of cognitive evolution. How to do that for young minds that are not yet crystallized around the thought and behavioral patterns that are perpetuating the meta crisis as you've described it?
Yeah, not working on making one of those Oxford intros. That'd be cool. But the Consilience papers, kind of the first series of them were mostly all about sense making. The next series that we're writing are all about the meta crisis and the criteria of a third attractor. And then hopefully the last series will be about specific kind of design processes for implementation. And we are in a process with MIT publishing right now on them publishing those as a series. So that second one should be, published intro. One of those papers, colleague Zach Stein is taking lead on right now, is on what is the future of education, particularly in a post-technological automation world where you're not preparing kids for a labor economy or workforce or things like that. And in a world of also information singularity where nobody can be an expert in anything. And in a world of AI, what is unique to human consciousness? Really, in a world of technological automation with both AI and robotics, what is unique to the role of humans in that cybernetic world that AI and robotics can't do? And what is an educational system that is developing them in that way? And what does a kind of economy and civilization around that look like? And human development at scale? And it's really fucking exciting. It's honestly the single most exciting topic there is for me, because I think almost everything we think about what human nature is just utter gibberish that is basically ubiquitous conditioning that has almost nothing to do with human nature. And under deeply enough different conditioning circumstances, we can have the very highest heights that any humans have ever reached ethically, intellectually, artistically, spiritually become the median. And I think that is the direction of it. And so given short amount of time, I will move to hear what Chris has to say and then we'll close. But yeah, fun topic. And I'm glad to hear that you work in that area and are working with young people learning.
Thank you. Thank you. So yes, we will have the last input for this session from Chris. So please go ahead.
Daniel, thanks for coming on. I was watching one of your store videos on, let's say, a measure for civilization, and you
Can't hear you, my friend. I'll let you know when we can hear you. We're not there yet. Wonder if maybe just your computer audio would work.
He couldn't hear your suggestion, Daniel, because he had his headphones off at that time.
We can't hear you, Chris. If you can hear, then you can either type your question or you can maybe take your microphone off and just try your computer mic. We'll give it another minute.
So Daniel, while we are waiting for Krista, just 1 minute. I found it very, very interesting that your comment on the plasticity of human nature and the potential to create a society and a culture where we can be much, much more fully human. I think it's the first time I've heard you say that this could be one of the most important lines of investigation and development. This paper that you are writing together with Zach, will that possibly be out before the Austin gathering?
Sadly, no. But it's a topic that we could do a breakout on there of like, what is the upper boundary of human potential, factoring human nature under what conditioning environments, and what does the future of human development enable in that way if we were to design it intentionally. And it's yeah, like I said, there is no topic that I'm more interested in than that. And then I see that Chris asked his question, Kim Persian from the STOA talk. Yeah, so there's a talk on the STOA if people want to check it out, talk about a kind of health index for society that the idea there was that when people have kind of coupled emotions, coupled mirror neurons, that they feel some kind of happiness when other people are happy. They feel some kind of sadness when other people are sad. The happiness at other people's happiness is kind of, compersion is the best word in English for it, but like I actually feel a win at your win. I feel a delight at your delight. And, I feel a loss at your loss is maybe empathy. That my well-being and your well-being emotionally being decoupled, you feel whatever, and I don't feel anything about it, which that is obviously very common, but they can also be anti-coupled, where actually I feel bad at your wins, which is kind of jealousy and envy, which then can also mean I feel good at your loss, which starts to look like sadism, but obviously revenge and vengeance and a lot of things are in that direction. So I talk about that, like the total amount of activity on the compassion compersion axis divided by the total amount of activity on the sadism jealousy axis would be a pretty good indication of the interpersonal psychosocial health of the society. And I do think that it is possible to have something like real compersion even in the presence of real competition, where even if someone is in a dynamic where their win and my win are not perfectly correlated, I can still actually empathize with their win and be stoked on it for them. And this is like a very basic concept of good gamesmanship. But yeah, I think that concept is decently discussed there. And so, yeah, but it's an interesting one.
Thank you. So we are almost exactly on the quarter. So I would just end by thanking everyone for turning up for this call. And of course, in particular, thank Daniel for sharing all your thoughts and ideas and provocations. I think this is an excellent starting point for many of our explorations together at the Austin gathering. So
it's really funny looking at the comments over here when I said we're not trying to make Tibet again, that we have a friend named Tibet in the group here. Tibet, good to see you, my friend. No, we want lots more Tibets, except there's only one of him in this particular way. He's working on actually some pretty great coordination projects that hopefully he shares with everybody. And of course, I'm actually a big fan of a lot of Tibetan culture and think that they're being taken over was both perfectly predictable and totally a tragedy. So I am not critiquing Buddhist culture in that, other than saying making things that are lovely and can't prevent their own destruction is not the thing that we are aiming for. All right. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thomas.
Thank you. See you all soon. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.